So this was like a prime site. This is recent. And yet, the Archaeological Survey of India, which is really the national, it's like the federal body that deals with archaeology in India, they couldn't control the site. They're underfunded, understaffed. And so right in this sacred site, which is one of the most key archaeological sites in South Asia, they're just farming it. The farmers just come in, they're farming it. They're taking all the little, trinkets, which could be 5,000 years old, but absolutely crucial to diagnose, what was going on. And they're just selling them and or throwing it away or repurposing it. And so
hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. What follows is an interview I recorded with Michael Granado and Dr. Howard Resnick. In this video, Michael interviews Dr. Howard Resnick on some of the history of the academic interactions with the Indian traditions. Dr. Howard Resnick has his PhD in Sanskrit and Indian Studies from Harvard University, and he's taught on the history of religions in India.
Thanks for having me, Arjuna. Absolute pleasure to meet with you, Dr. Resnick. Thank you for taking time out of your day to have this chat. So I would like to start off with some more historical questions, if you don't mind. And then maybe from there we can kind of transition to more theological / philosophical topics. This is largely in part to my own personal interest. I love ancient history, and I'm really curious about the Indus River Valley civilization. So I was wondering if we can start off there. Could you tell me a little bit about, tell us a little bit about the Indus River Valley civilization, kind of its history? I think we could focus more on the cultural aspects of it. And then maybe from there, we can kind of transition into how it influenced the Vedic period.
Yes, that's a happy coincidence, because the last several weeks I've been revisiting that whole issue in preparation, writing introduction to my version of the Mahabharata, an ancient Sanskrit text. So briefly, the Indus Valley is the valley of the Indus River. And the word Indus or Indus or India, it's actually originally from the Sanskrit word Sindhu, which means a large river. It can mean also a sea, even an ocean. And so a river pronounced an initial S like an H, so you get Hindu, Sindhu from Sindhu, and then the H is silent in Greece, so Sindhu became Hindu, became Indu, became Indus. Anyway, so basically, approximately 100 years ago, assumed that the first Egypt, of course, and so no one had really thought, no one knew that in India there was such an ancient urban civilization. And so the problem is that we still have not been able to decipher the language of these people. They found these seals, which are called Indus Valley seals or Harappan seals. A lot of them very small. Sometimes they're also inscribed on jars or other artifacts. And they're sort of pictographic. They're pictures of different kinds of animals in the region, or apparently like a sitting yogi, and so a fish. So there's all these symbols, but they've never been deciphered. There have been attempts to decipher them, but no one has really, proved. What's intriguing about it is that you have the Vedas, these ancient Sanskrit texts that describe cities in the region which overlaps with the Indus Valley civilization. And so I think it was David Frawley said that you have, according to Western scholarship, you have cities without a language, and then you have a language without the cities, the language being the Vedas. So he said, why not put the two together? Maybe that's true. For example, one remarkable feature of the Indus Valley civilization is that there's no real evidence of armies or significant warfare, and there's a lot of that in the Vedas. So, but in any case, we really don't know. And I have been I'm translating or presenting the Mahabharata, this great Sanskrit text that talks about a great civilization in India. And so I don't know if you want to get into the whole debate over where was the original homeland of the Indo-European civilization, because it was discovered in the late 1700s that Sanskrit, the sacred language of India actually is very much cognate with, it's part of the same language family as all European languages, except for Finnish, Hungarian, and Basque. But in terms of all the Romance languages, Germanic, Slavic languages, also ancient Hittite, Albanian, and so on, and certainly ancient Greek. So therefore, when you have people sharing the same language, naturally it's assumed that they shared a culture. For example, we have several languages, Romanian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and Italian, actually those 5 languages, which are which obviously come from Latin. So why? Because there was a Roman Empire and all those regions were part of the Roman Empire. So when you have this Indo-European language family, naturally the question arises, well, why? There must have been an Indo-European culture. And of course, this set off a huge culture war and a debate, because the foundational sacred understanding of Hindus, to use that somewhat, not exactly a precise term, but to use that term, the foundational sacred understanding is that they have an extremely ancient civilization in their holy land, which is Bharatvarsha, today India. I mean, back in the past, it included obviously what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of eastern Afghanistan, and so on. So, but that basically South Asia. So South Asia is the homeland of all of their most important sacred texts. And so the European scholars insisted, well, no, because if Indians come from India, Europeans come from India, and they didn't want to come from India. So they came up with all, especially because India was a colony and it was kind of, who wants to, they didn't want their fatherland or motherland or whatever to be a land of, especially, colonial peoples who are not even white. That was an embarrassment. It gets into racism. It gets into the whole colonial construct. And so by the time racism and colonialism sort of fell out of favor in the Western Academy, they were still, for other reasons, they were still really fixed on this idea that it's like keep away when you're a kid, with the ball, you play keep away. So it's like keep away from India. And Edwin Bryant, who's an old friend of mine, wrote, perhaps the most important book, or one of the most important books on this subject, called The Quest for the Indo-European, for the Origin of Indo-European Civilization, or something like that. Or The Quest for Vedic Civilization. And he basically, he is somewhat neutral. He just looks at all the evidence on both sides of this debate. And the evidence includes archaeological evidence, historical linguistic evidence, you could say textual evidence. What do the texts actually say? And then of course, genetic evidence, and comparing all these things to see how they mix and match. And what he shows is a word that he uses, and also just actually wrote to me just a few days ago, because we were talking about this, is that the evidence is extremely malleable. I mean, do you have a smoking gun? No. And so the same evidence can be interpreted to prove or to suggest or to favor the idea of an indigenous Vedic, Sanskritic, Indian homeland in India. And then, of course, Western scholars take the same evidence and try to prove the opposite. And the point is, neither side has to, both sides come up with arguments. On the Indian side, they're very strong arguments. But of course, it's very interesting, just as someone has made this comparison, just as in the old colonial racist period, you had the Europeans insisting that they do not come from Semitic peoples, or they do not come from let's say, Aryan stock. And so because India was ruled by Muslims for about 700 years, and the Muslim invasion of India, starting with Muhammad of Ghazni. And it was very brutal. It was cruel. It was savage. And I mean, obviously, there were some Muslims in India who were nice people. I mean, Akbar, the Emperor Akbar was a really nice guy and a real sort of, into world religions and everything. And he was a great emperor. You have the Delhi Sultanate, which ruled for, several hundred years. Then you get the Mughal Empire. And I taught actually the history of India at the University of Florida a few times. And it was really bad. I mean, obviously there are bright spots, there are happy moments, but in general, it was just awful. It was just this really savage repression of Hindu culture. And so it's interesting because in India, the Muslim population tends to be economically less advantaged and less educated than the Hindu population on average. I mean, obviously not everyone's like that, and so therefore the Western sort of neo-Marxist scholars who are, despite the fact that people claim to be Marxists, killed about 10 to 20 times more people than Hitler, but they sort of have historical amnesia about that. So it's kind of like this, the leftist academy that, poor people are always morally superior to rich people, and minorities are always superior to majorities. And so they have kind of like this secular religion they make about it. I mean, sometimes it's true and sometimes it's not true. And so therefore, because as India emerges out of this, from the post-colonial sort of this, several hundred year trauma, and of course the Muslims were replaced by the British, who did some good things for India and also did some things that are, were really very much not good. And so therefore, India, in asserting its independence, that we're not a colony anymore, and we're not being savaged by Muslim rulers, and we're not being, humiliated by British rulers, finally coming out of that, they want to assert their own original sacred tradition. But of course, that tradition is not the tradition of a minority in India, which is Muslim. And therefore, since minorities are always morally superior to majorities for the leftist academy, and so on and so forth, therefore, they tend to oppose what they call Hindu nationalism as something which is, unfair to the Muslim minority. And obviously, there are certain extremist versions of Hindu nationalism which are oppressive, but a lot of it isn't. And even the big part of it that is not oppressive, it's not racist, it's not persecuting Muslims, but it all kind of gets lumped in. Because I mean, the leftist academy tends to be really sloppy on their ideological issues. Like, for example, just to give one analogy, there's a debate, a philosophical debate, which has gone on for thousands of years, going back to ancient Greece, about whether the world kind of exists at random by the random interplay of, physical laws and so on, or whether there's some intelligence behind it. And this is a philosophical issue that predates Christianity by many centuries. And if you look today, there are some very brilliant people who have doctorates from the best universities in the world who argue on scientific and philosophical grounds that there is intelligent design. But if you look at the sort of the stupid Wikipedia article on intelligent design, Wikipedia, we all use it, it's very helpful. But whenever there's a Wikipedia article which involves sort of leftist academic dogma, it tends to be stupid and tends to give one side and so on. And I've seen many, many cases of this. And because Wikipedia, the powers that be, they will always defer to the leftist academy on controversial points. That's just one of their ground rules. So there are kind of flat earther, young earth people who argued that all of geology and all of paleontology, everything has to fit within the account of Genesis in the Old Testament, which is, as they say, that's a tough hoe to row. That's a tough row to hoe, as they say. You know, I mean, that's really difficult. So, but there are also brilliant scholars who argue that because we're finding in microbiology that it's not just mechanistic the way species evolve. It's not mechanistic as Darwin thought, because Darwin was working with very primitive biology. You know, that was like almost 200 years ago now. And so, you know, our knowledge of biological processes was very primitive now, then compared to now. So now we find there's information transfer. It's almost like digital, that really species evolve or species mutate according to this extremely sophisticated, complicated information transfer. So the question comes up, where does the information come from? Well, all I mean to say is that there's a tendency for, I mean, let me put it this way, and then I'll get back to the Harappan. You know, we may think of the Western universities as places of free speech, but that's very ahistorical. Because if you look at the history of the Western university, a history which is roughly 1,000 years old, you know, the proto-university started with the Carolingian Renaissance, you know, of Charlemagne, you know, in the early 800s, and then gradually universities emerged. And so for the first, well, what would it be? 700 years. We're only talking about 1,000 years. So the first probably 700 years, these universities were tightly controlled by churches, you know, mostly by the Roman Catholic Church. So for the first 2/3 to 3/4 of the history of the Western university, including, you know, Oxford and Sorbonne and everything, we're not talking about a free speech institution. We're talking about the place where you're free to speculate and use your intelligence and be creative within a dogmatic structure. And so then you have this little brief moment where it's evolving into, or devolved, whatever you want to call it, into a sort of leftist ideological institution, which is strongly committed to atheism or agnosticism. They even have the term methodological atheism, which is obviously not very bright because it's not objective. It's not neutral. But in any case, so you have this period, maybe in the 1800s, where you could there were all kinds of competing worldviews. But then the Western Academy epistemologically and ontologically hardens again into sort of this, at best, agnostic, atheistic, physicalist, materialist, dogmatic worldview. And so it's really just, there are these very brief Camelot moments when Western universities actually are free speech places and free thought, but almost for its entire history, it has been dogmatically controlled, the Western university, first by, you know, the Christian church, and then by leftist ideology, atheism, and things like that. So getting back to the Harappan civilization, otherwise you might have thought that my age, you know, I forgot what I was talking about. But so getting back to the Harappan, what Edwin Bryan has shown very clearly, because he was admirably neutral, and he showed that the evidence can be interpreted both ways. And so it's really more of the sociology of knowledge. It's more like dogmatic that, you know, most scholars, but now it's changing, because the old academic consensus of neo-Marxism and atheism and physicalism and methodology, that's really collapsing. It's heavily under siege because it's just so silly, and it's so unintellectual, and it's so philosophically so silly and so presumptuous that it's sort of collapsing now, so we can have a free discussion. So it gets back to the question of, what was this original Indo-European culture? Where did it come from? and its relationship to the ancient sacred culture of India. That's basically the issue. And then Harappa, the Indus Valley civilization, it's like, who gets that trophy? Because it's a very impressive civilization, indoor plumbing and showers. And it was a very impressive civilization. I mean, I'm a big fan of indoor plumbing. So you probably, especially in Wisconsin, my God.
Yeah.
So that's basically it. And what Edwin Bryan shows very clearly, and other scholars are showing, is that the evidence doesn't tip the Indus Valley civilization into the basket of the indigenous Aryan civilization from India. It certainly doesn't tip it into the side of those who want the Indo-European homeland to be in the central steppes of Asia, or anywhere but India. It's kind of like anywhere but India.
So if I can try to summarize what you said for a second, and by all means, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. This is a really important discussion historically, because I think the Indian civilization kind of represents an example where this happens. But one of the big questions in history today is, you brought up the word post-colonial. It's only been within the past less than 100 years that we've started to examine these civilizations on their own grounds, and not through a white European lens, right? And so what I hear you saying is that we kind of have this, there's this debate that's happening, and this debate, without a doubt, there's more at stake than just history. There's nationalistic identity. There's a people's identity at stake, a personal, a spiritual identity at stake, that this conversation involves. And so with this, is it a Indo-European civilization, or is it a native Indian civilization? You presented kind of both sides. In your own scholarly opinion, where would you fall?
Well, academically, I would probably just say we don't have conclusive evidence yet. Let's say on spiritual or metaphysical grounds, I do support the idea that there was a very ancient civilization in India. And one of the problems, India is kind of like the worst place to do archaeology for various reasons. Because you can say, where's the art? Here's some of the reasons. One, the climate. They have in North India, where most of the important events took place, at least in the texts, ancient texts, brutally hot. India has been continuously occupied, so that you go to an archaeological site and people are farming the land. I mean, they found some of the most important archaeological sites, like Rocky Garhi, which is right really in the Mahabharata heartlands, in the heartland of the ancient sacred Sanskrit histories. And it's very hard, because of the climate, it's very hard to reconstruct DNA in South Asia. And so they finally, found I think it was a lady that died like 4,500 years ago. And they were actually able to reconstruct the DNA. So this was like a prime site. This is recent. And yet the Archaeological Survey of India, which is really the national, it's like the federal body that deals with archaeology in India, they couldn't control the site. They're underfunded, understaffed. And so right in this sacred site, which is one of the most key archaeological sites in South Asia, they're just farming it. The farmers just come in, they're farming it. They're taking all the little, trinkets, which could be 5,000 years old, and absolutely crucial to diagnose, what was going on. And they're just selling them or throwing it away, or repurposing it. And so India is a very, very difficult place, and also continuous occupation. So you take a place, let's say, which was an ancient city, but people never stopped living there. And people, I mean, in a sense, because in the Indus Valley civilization, because the course of the river changed, and as we know, in pre-industrial times, people lived on rivers. I mean, every major European city is on a river. Of course, the technological industrial revolution changed that, and so people still live there. And so let's say you had an ancient palace or an ancient neighborhood or whatever, people never stopped living in it. Another thing about India is it's very strongly a cremation culture. So as we know, like say in Egypt, perhaps the main way we reconstruct ancient Egyptian civilization is through burial sites, like in the pyramids. And so they didn't do a lot of burials in India. It's a cremation culture. And so there's all kinds of reasons why, but when you look closely, you start to find, now one thing is that more advanced civilization is always associated with agriculture. You have, hunting, gathering, which hunters and gatherers cannot have large scale communities or societies because you strip the forest, you kill all the game, then you have to move on. They're semi-nomadic. But when you have an agrarian economy where you can produce grains that you can store forever, then you can have large scale civilization. With that, you get division of labor, you get specialization and all that. And so they've found now, archaeologists have found the growing of rice and millet and other grains in India within the Mahabharata heartland, going back many, many, many thousands of years. I mean, far beyond the ancient date that the sacred tradition itself gives for the events of, say, the Mahabharata. So if you want to reconstruct a history that basically confirms or is compatible with or doesn't contradict the ancient sacred texts, you can do that. There's some problems like horse remains, because there are a lot of horses in these ancient texts. Wars and cavalry, and so where are the horses? But then again, did they bury horses? Probably not. They probably cremated them. And so, and then another problem is there's what they call, I forget the Latin names, but there's like sort of the horse proper, like, what we would call the modern horse. And then there's a type of mule or donkey, but the problem is, in terms of a lot of the archaeological remains, they're kind of the same. And so the Western scholars who want to say, they don't find a lot of horse remains in South Asia, so that can't be the culture of the Vedas with all the cavalry and everything. And the people who argue for an indigenous homeland for the great Indo-European culture or Sanskrit culture, they say, well, it was a horse. And so it's just, as you can see how the evidence, it just depends on, what game do you want to play? So personally, I have to say, based on my metaphysical experiences and so on, that I tend to go with the idea that there is a Sanskritic or Vedic homeland in India. Now, if you see, even that, you could say, well, if that's true, then does that mean that the Europeans came from India? Well, it's hard to say. For example, the example I just gave, that you have Latin, which was obviously the language of the Roman people, but then you have Latin languages like French, like Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian. It doesn't mean that all the original, let's say, Proto-French speakers or Proto-Spanish or Portuguese speakers all originally came from Italy. So what we know from history is that the Romans conquered different areas, and sometimes it's not only conquering. I mean, some places weren't actually conquered. Some places just kind of, wanted to join the empire because there were all kinds of advantages, and developed sort of Latin-esque languages. And so the fact that you have this language family spread out all the way from India to Ireland doesn't necessarily mean that all the people came from the same place. So even that assumption is not necessarily true. And so there doesn't need to be an original homeland where all the speakers of Indo-European languages originally came from and lived together somewhere, because languages can spread in other ways, not just migration and not just by military conquest. Sometimes languages just spread. For example, of all the people in the world today who speak English, perhaps not as their first language, but who speak English, it's not that in every case they were conquered by England or America. So languages can spread, sometimes merchants can go. And so it's a complicated thing. So again, the simple answer is by academic, secular scholarship, you cannot prove that much.
Okay. So this is kind of, I think, building off of that previous statement. So yeah, you have like late 19th century, early 20th century. I try to explain to my students a lot of time that these historical views are largely influenced by a cultural context, the cultural context of the late 19th century, early 20th century, for lack of, to put it bluntly, was inherently racist, right? So you have a lot of early German historians who are arguing that white European peoples, they identified those with the Indo-European peoples, and that these peoples are the ones that brought technology to brown people, right?
Yeah, and brought the Vedas, even brought the wisdom.
Yeah, so that's where I'm going to. So we have this idea.
I just thought, as a little note here, racism was universal.
Mm-hmm.
Racism is not, for example, slavery was abolished in West Africa half a century later than it was in America. And this is black on black slavery. So, tribalism, and there's a thin line between racism and tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to make clear that it's not a peculiarly, let's say, Caucasian moral deficiency.
Yeah.
Because, I think it's good because, the only difference is at a certain point in history, and certainly not at all points in history, white people, Europeans, became ascendant militarily and colonialism because, for one thing, the discovery of the Americas and the chance to perform pious deeds like enslaving, the indigenous peoples, if not destroying them. But in any case, so racism really back then was the moral equivalent today of nationalism. For example, we assume that if you go to Mexico or Canada or Armenia or some, Polynesian island, the people are nationalists.
Mm-hmm.
Nationalism it's universal now. Although there are internationalist historical forces that are sort of, somewhat in tension with nationalism. I'll call you back. So, sorry, it's a good friend who, so it was a moral equivalent of today would be nationalism. It wasn't considered to be an evil, and it wasn't considered to necessarily justify genocide because of Hitler. In a sense, Hitler, after post-Hitler, you can't really be a racist. Although pre-Hitler, you could, and you could be considered a moral human being basically anywhere in the world. Basically anywhere in the world. And so, so I just thought I'd throw that out.
Oh, well, so I bring this up largely because one of the...
I'm sorry, forgive me, but just to give one simple example. When the first, let's say in the modern period, last like 1,000 years, so when the first Europeans, who I think were Dutch, sailed into a Japanese harbor. And of course, the Japanese had never seen a Caucasian, and they thought the white people were grotesque and ugly. You know, they had these like thin noses, which they thought was like really bizarre. And so, you know, the Japanese response to the first white people they saw was like, these are like freakish people. And of course, nowadays, you know, you can't say things like that about other races. So, but it was pretty much all over the world. I mean, I can't think of a civilization which wasn't racist. Certainly pre-color.
Yeah, as a general rule, I tell my students before 1950, basically racism was the norm. But
Yeah.
So I bring this up because one of the big ideas in early Indian history is this idea of the quote, Aryan invasion. And this has been interpreted in a lot of different ways. It was interpreted very radically by the Nazis, right? That's probably the far end of the spectrum, right? The idea that all the major civilizations originated in some way, shape, or form from an original Aryan race. But leaving that kind of conspiratorial thinking aside, the Aryan hypothesis kind of morphed, and it's been a while since I've read any current literature on it, but it's my understanding that you have this influx of Indo-European speaking people. It was not combative, but it was more so like a migration.
Exactly.
And the question that I want to ask you about this period is a question about the history of native Indian religion, which is, how big of a religious influence did these people have? I mean, I think the current narrative is that the two cultures kind of met and mingled together, and that out of that you get the Vedas.
Right. It's well, the colonial racist narrative was, and I remember when I was at Harvard, I asked my professor about the invasion, the Aryan invasion. He just laughed at it. He said, that's a 19th century theory. So now it is Aryan migration.
Yeah.
The idea is that the superior, Teutonic, the superior white specimens streamed into South Asia and gradually obviously took control, being a more hardy, intelligent race. And then in South India, South Indians tend to be darker than North Indians. I mean, and a lot of North Indian people are actually Caucasian. I mean, they're not white, but they're Caucasian. I can mention one point why that really struck me as being like remarkably silly about this idea. And I'll explain why. That's something I'm just going over in the last few days. That the idea is that you had these nomadic, or at best semi-nomadic people in the, let's say, Central Asian steppes, based on finding literally a tiny, tiny number of chariot remnants or horse bones. I mean, it's almost like you have this huge building which is balanced on a little coin that's turned up sideways, and just anyway. So these people migrated, or however you want to do it, into South Asia, and then promptly forgot they did so. And because the book they produced, I mean, not written, but oral tradition, was the Rig Veda, which is this very large book, linguistically very sophisticated. And I remember my professor at Harvard, Witzel, who was a world famous Vedicist, he said that it was really the memorizing of this text from the time it was composed was the greatest feat of memory, of memorization in human history. Because the belief, at least in terms of the Vedas, and there's all these different categories of ancient Sanskrit literature that we call Vedic, but in terms of the Samhitas, like the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, and so on, the power was in the phoneme, the power was in the sound itself. And just to give one simple example, there's a famous story where Indra, who's basically, Zeus, a little better behaved than Zeus, but anyway, so Indra wanted to create this like sort of not monster, but this like really powerful being. No, I'm sorry. Indra killed this sage who was offering oblations also to the bad guys, not only the devas, the gods, but also to the asuras. So therefore, Indra killed this Brahmana because he was empowering evil forces because he had a family connection. So he killed him. So this sage's father, who was Twashta, one of the devas that rule the world, he decided to perform for revenge, a great sacrifice to produce this powerful being who would kill Indra. And so at one point, all the mantras he had to chant, very elaborate, there was the word Indra Shatru. The person Indra, Shatru means mortal enemy. And so what he needed to say was Indra Shatru, which means the mortal enemy of Indra, a being that would kill Indra. But in the midst of all these hundreds and thousands of mantras, he just misplaced the accent. He got the words right, but misplaced. So he said Indra Shatru, which means that being would have Indra as its mortal enemy. And Indra would kill this being. And that's what happened. So, but the point here is that the power was in the vibration, the sound itself. And therefore, it's absolutely essential to memorize every syllable, every phoneme, every accent. And they did it. They actually did it. Now going back to the Indo-European question, you have a group of people, semi-nomadic or nomadic, sheep herders or, people on horseback. They're not known for producing great literature. Like, for example, Genghis Khan. Where's the library of all the great literature? His nomadic hordes, swept into, or, Attila the Hun, where are the libraries they produced? And yet you have these nomadic people who stream into South Asia, and they just sort of, sit down and write this book. They didn't write it. They composed this book. Now, first of all, no one composed the Rig Veda without being a super intellect. The Sanskrit is difficult even for modern Sanskritists. It's actually in some ways, it has verb conjugations that actually dropped out in classical Sanskrit. So classical, I remember I had another professor at Harvard, nice guy, Jim Benson, and he started out at Stanford in Greek and Latin, and then switched to Sanskrit. He's at Oxford now, I think. And he said that Sanskrit was actually more complex than ancient Greek and Latin. And so first of all, and that's kind of classical Sanskrit, and the people who compose the Rig Veda uses Sanskrit, which is even more complicated. So it's like this really, and we still can't decipher all of it. So it's this really, really sophisticated language. And it's a very big thing. It has, it's beautiful, beautiful literature when I read it, because I can, understand some of it because I know Sanskrit, but I find it thrilling to read. I find the language thrilling, just linguistically, poetically. And they not only these are like little, nomadic herders, people herding animals and wander around the Central Asian steppes, wander into South Asia, and just, compose one of the most sophisticated literatures ever composed. And then they memorize it down to the last tiny accent and phoneme. Now, that absolutely doesn't happen unless you have a division of labor. You have a designated, specialized intellectual class like Brahmins, very sophisticated, with a mastery of linguistics. And that's coming from these, sheep herders. And so the idea, not only that, here's a people who performed the greatest feat of memorization in human history. I remember, Professor Wilson Harvard used to say, see, it's like we have a tape recording of the chanting, thousands and thousands of years ago. And so these people who performed the greatest feat of memorization in human history couldn't even remember where they came from. They completely forgot because they think in the Veda, they come from India. When I grew up in a community where all of our grandparents, came from Eastern Europe and some from Russia. And we knew exactly where our ancestors came from. You probably know where your ancestors come from. And yet the people that performed the greatest feat of memorization in human history we came from India, right? No, well, yeah. They can't even remember where they come from. And yet they can memorize the Rig Veda. So I find that ludicrous. I find it just absurd. And I don't know if that argument's been given. Naturally, I will be strongly inclined to take credit for it and to be, proudly think that that's my argument. But to be honest, I'm sure someone must have thought of that. But so when I heard that these nomadic people, nomadic people don't compose great literature and they don't memorize it. Specialized classes. And the Rig Veda already talks about this Varna caste system, where you have the Brahmins, the intellectuals, teachers, and priests. You have the warrior kings, and the governors. You have the people who produce what society needs. People that produce food and trade and so on. And then you have the working class. And so they already have that. But division of labor doesn't come from nomadic peoples. Division of labor comes from agrarian societies. So, just looking at it objectively, it seems kind of absurd, this idea, especially that they forgot where they came from.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's the first time I've heard it put that way. So I'll give you credit where credit's due. Because it's always struck me as odd, and this is not my area of background, so it's not like I really had a whole lot of resources to go off of to disagree. So would you say it's more so a linguistic influence then? Like, what I hear you saying is that the culture, the religion, the social structure, the economic complex was already there. You have these people that migrate into it.
No, I'm saying the opposite.
Okay.
I'm saying I think that these people who have this little almost like superhuman memory knew exactly where they came from, and where they came from is where they were living. Okay. And so my view is that they're also genetically, there's no conclusive evidence of a major migration into India. For example, I just read something in the Smithsonian magazine, and you assume the Smithsonian Institute magazine is not just a mouthpiece for Hindu nationalism, and so the genetic evidence we have, going as far back as we can, is that the people, for example, in the Harappan or Indus Valley culture area, are genetically the same as modern Indians.
Okay.
So the idea of a migration, I can't, to me, it's obviously no cigar. And to me, it's kind of like it's the sort of post-colonial stepchild of the colonialist idea. And it's just, you can't prove that. There's just no proof of it. And again, DNA evidence, Indus Valley people, kind of like modern Indians. The Rig Veda, these people who performed the greatest feats of memory in human history, they remember they come from South Asia.
Okay.
And so,
Sorry.
yeah, well, I'm just saying, so I think we cannot discuss on the basis of a working hypothesis that these people migrated in. I think because that really, that's not a level playing field. If we want to talk on a level playing field, we'd have to say, no, we don't assume that they entered South Asia by migration. We cannot assume that.
Okay.
And if you want to say, okay, we need a smoking gun for the fact they were always there, to me, the linguistic evidence is overwhelming, because these are people who had, they were like, I remember when I was a kid, I used to read Superman comic books, and there was, I still love them, and they had Future Man. It's like his head had evolved into this big thing, naturally no hair. I guess he was a Hare Krishna. So, but anyway, so, I mean, these were like these future men. These were like these brainiac people with super memories, and they forgot where they came from. And if they came into South Asia, how did they suddenly develop this, super agrarian? Not only that, the dates given for migration are much, much later than proof for agrarian civilization, not only in the Indus Valley culture, but even deep into India. So the idea that that all the sacred texts of India are wrong, and it's from the Indian or Hindu point of view, the people who were our colonial masters, it's still an academic colony. Because in terms of our own story, like our own identity, we're still under the control of our colonial masters. Maybe they don't govern us politically or militarily, but academically, they are still our colonial masters. They still dictate to us. They tell us who we are. We do not have the right even to say who we are and where we come from. They will tell us who we are. And so to me, it's just colonialism just shifted from the military and political to the academy. So you can understand there's an extraordinary amount of resentment in India about this, that you won't even let us tell our own story. And there are very good scholars in India so I don't mean to say that the Western scholars are all bad people or colonialists. I mean, some of them, they're very intelligent. Some of them are trying to be fair, but there's a huge amount of this particular academic issue has been hugely politicized. So if you don't say the right thing in the Western Academy, you will be attacked viciously. You'll be called names. You don't believe it? Look at Wikipedia. If you want to see articles written by Western scholars who ridicule and bully and belittle anyone who disagrees with them. And Edwin Bryant, in his book, one of the main things he keeps pleading for is that let's be a little more respectful. That in South Asia, in India, there are some very smart people that study these things, and they really do read all the material, and they come to different conclusions. And let's stop ridiculing them. Let's stop bullying them. Let's stop stigmatizing them, and just let's have a conversation. And so one of the problems is that the sort of mainstream Western academy hasn't really got to the point yet where the mainstream level, they can just have a mutually respectful conversation. And on the Indian side, because, on both sides, some people are kind of hotheads on both sides, not everyone, not most people. And so on the Indian side, sometimes they really, come up with some zingers. And they kind of demonize the Western scholars in terms of, post-colonial rhetoric. And so the whole thing is really overheated. And so what Edwin Bryant's calling for, and I absolutely support him in this, is that everyone needs to kind of, put your guns down, This is not, an Old West gunfight. Mutual respect. Let's listen to each other. Let's be methodologically fair. And like both East and West, let's not overstate our evidence. Let's not claim that we've proved something when in fact we have evidence that is suggestive. And so that's been a problem, that the Western Academy, which really controls academics in the world, to a great extent, the most prestigious universities are either Western or along the Western model in Japan and even China. And so I think what we need to do is to have a fair conversation with mutual respect. And that just hasn't happened. And so I think the evidence does not point to a migration as sort of the default working hypothesis. Not at all.
Gotcha. And along the same lines, and I think I know how you would answer this, but I want to hear it from your own mouth. So along the same lines, the idea with the Aryan hypothesis is the idea that not only did they bring the language and the technology, which your argument there is pretty convincing. I mean, technologically speaking, the technology was already, they're going into Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which didn't really have a technological equivalent other than places like maybe ancient Egypt or ancient China. But so, but the other side of the argument, or the further extension of the argument, is that they also brought their religious traditions, and that a type of religious synchronism took place between the Indo-European peoples and the native Indians.
I think that is the most difficult thing to prove, because the main source we have for the Aryan religion is the Rig Veda. And it's precisely the Rig Veda, which could not have been produced by wandering tribes herding their animals. And so I think it's precisely the religious core, which is the Sanskrit Vedas, which is most obviously not the product of migrants. And so as far as syncretism, I think my experience in the world, like you having studied a lot, is that in most civilizations in the world that have lasted, that have survived, there's a wisdom tradition it's worth the trouble to look at. It's interesting because in the Bhagavad Gita, what Krishna says that wisdom comes from not just this or that culture and this or that part of the world. He says it comes from virtue. That in a state of virtue, virtuous people have relatively clear consciousness, and they notice things, they have wisdom. So there's this link between virtue and wisdom. And therefore, my experience is that all around the world, there have been some virtuous people, and they were wise. And so there's a certain sort of universal wisdom, which is not necessarily advanced theology, but it is a solid base of virtue and wisdom. And so let's say, obviously, so just for the sake of discussion, let's say the people who composed the Rig Veda were native to India, just for the sake of discussion. And as we know, in India, there were all kinds of subcultures, other cultures which might not have been dominant. But I mean, even in America, there's a whole subculture in America which denies science, frankly, on the left and the right, which is not always noticed. On the right, we know, climate change. On the left, basically, in any sociology, any history which contradicts leftist dogma, it's the science that's rejected, not the dogma. And so I think it would be rather silly to think that science denial is the monopoly of the right. Science denial basically comes from extremists, because when people become extreme, to be fanatical or extremist precisely means that your claims exceed your knowledge, and that you you're blind to the other side. You only see your side. And so on everywhere in the political spectrum, I mean, wherever you have extremism, you have science denial, because the only way you can sustain a fanatical dogma is by denying all the science that contradicts it. And science and wisdom do tend to regularly contradict fanatical positions. So, but getting back to South Asia, there's always been diversity. So you find, like, indigenous, in India also, you find indigenous people they might have been geographically separated, like up in the mountains or in the jungles or in the deserts. I mean, there are always people who, by their geographic isolation, or tend to develop their own culture because, they're an isolated community. And so there was interaction. And if you read the ancient Sanskrit texts, it's not that the people, let's say the so-called Aryan, said, "Ooh, you don't speak Sanskrit, so you're just a dummy, you don't know anything." No, there's all kinds of local customs. Just to give one simple example from Mahabharata, there was a general Sanskritic, you could say Aryan culture, that when a marriage was going to take place, that the bride's family would give a dowry. And I won't get into that. There's all kinds of things you could say about dowries, but that's a different topic. So in the Mahabharata, in a very famous scene, when Bhishma went to the northwest, what would now be maybe northwestern Pakistan, to the kingdom of Madra, because he wanted to ask for the princess Madri, which just means the princess of Madra, to be the second wife of Pandu. When he went there, her brother, Shalya, who apparently the father died and her brother was now in charge. And he said, "Well, we do things differently here." He said, "When we are a very proud dynasty, and when we give a princess to be married, you give us a dowry." And so Bhishma, he didn't say that's not Vedic. He just got out his checkbook. So the idea is, even in the ancient sacred texts, there are cultural differences. There are different customs in different places. And so it's not this, they share a lot. The basic outlines of the culture, they tend to share, but there's all kinds of differences, which clearly were regional, which might be, to use that really funny word, autochthonous. They got to come up with a better, they got to come up with a pronounceable word for that. say indigenous.
Yeah.
Scholars love words that common people can't pronounce or understand. So even in the ancient text, you find cultural variance and regional customs. So therefore, it's not like everyone, it's like the people with the Sanskrit culture were just trying to destroy no. It's much more complex. There's all kinds of things going on.
Those were the primary questions that I had. I do have some more religious / theological questions, but I want to be respectful of people's time. My time's getting a little tight here as well.
We could schedule for the future another theology meeting.
That sounds good to me.
Unfortunately, I was having technical problems during this recording, which was why I had trouble jumping into the discussion at times. It turns out my computer was overheating because the cooling system had failed, which was causing the CPU to get throttled. I finally worked that out, and now that's all sorted, so I've been able to do some live streams since then. Hopefully I can organize another discussion between these two souls in the future. I found this one very interesting. If you like this sort of stuff, be sure to subscribe. Let us know what you think down in the comments, and hit the like button to help us in the algorithm. I'll catch you in the next one. Hare Krishna.